Meeting to order. I get a motion to approve the agenda. Dykema Watson. Any discussion of the agenda? Favor? Opposed? The agenda is approved. Motion to approve the minutes. Moved. Watson, Medina. Discussion of the minutes. All those in favor? Opposed? The minutes are approved. All right. Unfinished business. Nothing listed. New business. Legislative update. We'll start with the state side.
Good afternoon. So again, not a lot of updates to share right now. Little, kind of continuation of our last update in that, there still are conversations just kind of starting on the budget. We are expecting, the focus will be on completing a budget before or by the September 30th deadline, and those conversations are really this week, kind of just starting to begin kind of collectively. There have been, I think, more isolated conversations. And when the legislature comes back to regular session after the Labor Day holiday this coming weekend, I think we'll see a lot more intense and earnest discussions taking place. There was talk that the House might be presenting their version, House Republicans, their version of the budget this week. It's unclear if that still is the plan, and it sounds like that may be less likely to happen at this point, and just direct negotiations between the Senate Democratic majority and the governor's office and work on that. So I think a lot of fingers crossed that there will an agreement will be reached by September 30th and no shutdown. And while it seems like not too far off, when the legislature seems to function more effectively with deadlines. So the House and Senate have been meeting a little bit, in the month of August, not necessarily on the same schedule, starting to see some bills move and I think some positive signs when it comes to the budget. The Senate moving some bills, kind of more bipartisan bills that have come out of the House, and we're starting to see the same on the House side. They are back in session again this week, mostly committee activity, but still activity taking place and probably limited session and floor votes. But again, I think signs folks are kind of preparing for negotiations and a lot of work to start getting done come September. So, some of the big issues out there, as mentioned before on the budget, obviously, federal actions have created gaps in programs and funding, and so there'll be decisions about how and whether, I guess, whether and how the state tries to fill those gaps with general fund revenues and what that means for other areas of the budget. Negotiations on road funding and how that may or may not take away, what GF dollars will be committed in that regard. So a lot of factors at play, a little bit of reduction in revenues from projections, but still, mostly on track in that regard. The bigger concerns are losses of federal revenue, and largely that's with Medicaid and SNAP. So again, a lot of continuing, a lot of things haven't really changed much in the last month, but expect that to really, all those conversations, those negotiations to begin in the next couple of weeks and continue through September. Happy to answer any questions if there are any.
I don't have a question. Really, no, but thank you for the update.
Anyone? Nope. Okay, all right, thank you. How about Andy?
Good afternoon to everyone. Similarly to Lansing, and probably even more so, Congress has not been here for a long time. This is the last week of their break before they come to town next Tuesday. There will be 14 legislative days between when they arrive next Tuesday and the end of the fiscal year when both the House and Senate are jointly in session. Does not give them a lot of time to figure out how they will stave off a government shutdown at the end of September. Couple things just to sort of keep in mind as you're listening to all of the news reports and things around government shutdowns. One, unlike reconciliation, it will require some degree of cooperation amongst Democrats and Republicans. In the Senate in particular, it requires 60 votes to move a spending bill forward, which means at least 7 Democrats would have to vote yes. And my guess is there are probably at least 1 or 2 Republicans that would vote no, which ups that number for Democrats closer to 10. If you recall, the last time there was this sort of debate around a continuing resolution, a handful of Democrats, including Gary Peters, voted yes, along with Chuck Schumer, and there was a lot of backlash for folks from sort of the party base on that, which makes it a little tougher for Democratic senators to go along this time if they don't get some of their demands included in any type of spending bill. There's a lot of sort of things floating underneath the current on that. Most notably, I think, is around this notion that if they agree to it, what stops the administration from setting up a rescissions package that would ultimately cut funding that was just approved in a continuing resolution? And without any type of sort of assurances and resolution to that issue, I think it becomes really difficult to get some type of continuing resolution through and prevent a shutdown. Not saying a shutdown is imminent, but I am saying it is, I would say, slightly better than a 50% chance that there is a government shutdown at the end of the month of September, simply because the dysfunction between Democrats and Republicans and the differences between their spending priorities means that both sides have to move a pretty large distance towards each other in order to come to some type of an agreement. No one thinks that they're going to pass the spending bills for FY26 in time for the start of the fiscal year on October 1st. So we are looking at either sort of a continuing resolution situation or a government shutdown situation. The scary part to me about a shutdown is I don't necessarily see sort of an obvious resolution that gets them out of a shutdown once it goes into effect. Democrats don't really have much leverage at that point to bring folks back to avoid a shutdown, other than to make bigger concessions than they would have had to make at the start of these negotiations. And the president gets sort of a very large amount of discretion during a government shutdown to deem who is essential and who is not, and what parts of the federal government are operating and which parts are not. And so that might be the one factor that would cause Democrats to sort of go along with something they may not love to avoid a shutdown. The other big issue, and we've talked with Mariah about this, that's getting a lot of attention, was the executive order that came out at the beginning of August around how the federal granting process is going to work and the changes that will result. Typically, most federal grants were handled by professional staff and program managers, and the notice of funding opportunities were drafted by them. And while the political appointees could sort of inject themselves if they so wanted, there weren't requirements that they sign off on things. They kind of weren't all that involved in the, especially in sort of the repeat grant programs that the federal government operates. The executive order that the president signed sort of changes some of those things. Most notably, it says that projects should demonstrably advance the president's policy objectives, which is sort of their way of saying they don't want to fund anything around climate change, DEI, immigration, all of those types of things that would be contrary to what the Trump administration has been doing. It's not a total surprise that they don't love those kinds of things, but it is a much more heavy-handed approach, because what they've said is not only do they have to sort of advance the president's policy objectives, but that a political appointee must sign off on every single notice of funding opportunity before it goes out. And what that is leading to, based on some of the information we have about some NOFOs that were sort of very close to being released and then sort of got caught up in this new executive order, is that they're being rewritten in certain areas to more, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to say it's just semantics, but to more align with the president's priorities. Why don't we say that? I'm not sure yet if that means that the substance of some of those grants will change, or whether or not they've rewritten the funding notices to make it sound more like a Trump-type funding notice. We'll have to see when that comes out. But a couple of things to highlight. One is that obviously political appointees now have a lot of more discretion in this process. One of the most concerning sort of provisions that were included in this was the notion that they were going to change the guidance on grants to include language in all federal grants going forward that gives the federal government the ability to terminate grants for convenience. And what that really means is they can cancel your grant at more or less any time. So for instance, if you were to receive a federal grant and maybe some city official, maybe something were to happen that would anger the administration, they might say, and we're going to cancel this transit grant for the city of Ann Arbor. We're going to cancel this grant. Do we know that will happen? No. But do we see that something like that could possibly happen based on the language in this executive order? Absolutely. And what it does, I think, is it gives the administration sort of this hammer to hold over people's heads to say, hey, we want you to do this. And then you say no, and then they come back to you and say, if you don't do this, we're canceling these federal grants. And so I think that there is a lot of effort to sort of use federal funding as leverage to advance their priorities. That's sort of what's really happening here. And what I think I said to Mariah, and I still think it holds true, is this is just a more like clever and strategic way of what they tried to do in the very first days of the Trump administration, when the OMB sent a letter basically freezing all federal grants and sort of allowing for the administration to review them all and determine which ones should get funded and which ones should not. They got beat back pretty quickly by that. And so they took some time and they came up with a little more creative way to essentially freeze federal funding for now and to give themselves a much bigger role in where the money ultimately flows. Again, I don't want to repeat myself too much, but it's not coincidence that that executive order came out the very first week that Congress was gone for a whole month, because members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, would probably be a little critical of that approach. They certainly were when OMB tried to freeze federal funding, and I suspect they will be again when they get back to town next week and people start asking about it. But in our current media circles, this happened like a whole month ago. There's been like 100 things that have happened since then that are probably going to cause members of Congress to get asked about, and we'll have to see where this one falls. But it is a very significant change to the way federal grant processes could work. And we don't have any sort of new NOFOs out under these parameters just yet, but we expect them before the end of the fiscal year. And therefore, we will get our first look at sort of how big of an impact this executive order will ultimately have on federal grant process. And so why don't I stop there? I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm sorry I'm not the bearer of good news today on these things, but I think it's certainly something that we need to be paying close attention to.
I'm just wondering, do you have anything written on this, that you can share with us, or is there, or anything?
Yeah, I
Or
put
is
some
it-
stuff together, not as formal, but yeah, I'll put something together that sort of lays out
Okay,
some of these particulars and send that around.
okay, thank you. Hmm. Okay, all right,
Thank you.
thanks. Okay, do we have any information or upcoming business? Okay. All right, that brings us to public comment. I think we have one caller on the line. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a comment, press *9. Okay. Seeing no interest, public comment is closed. Can I get a motion to adjourn? All right. All those in favor? Opposed? We are adjourned.